Hello and welcome back to the Texas Public Policy Foundation's election night live election night coverage. This is the last segment for the night, and I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and we are here with the great, the wonderful, the venerable Chuck DeVore. Chuck DeVore is our Vice President of National Initiatives. He is a former elected official in California and ran for Lieutenant Governor.
Ran for the U.S. Senate in 2010.
U.S. Senate, that's right, U.S. Senate. So Chuck obviously has a lot of electoral experience, and then obviously has been in Texas for a long, long time and been following the news here. So I have a lot to get to because there's obviously some returns coming in, some breaking news, that kind of thing. But the one thing that I think that's really interesting about kind of what you're looking at, Chuck, is we are waiting for the returns to come in. Right. We're all sitting around and we're like, and it's become this sort of like slog now where I remember even as a kid following some of this stuff, or, as a high school student, you knew by 9 o'clock, the big races, all of that kind of stuff. You just don't know that now. I mean, even the races, some of the races that they're calling, they're calling with half of the ballots still not counted.
Right.
Well, like, what's going on? What is so different about today and the way that they do things? You would think technology, would help with that. So what are you looking at? And what are the issues with getting the ballots counted?
So a lot's happened over the last 10 years as we've seen nationwide this increasing push toward early voting and toward using the mail to conduct elections. Now, we have 6 states that are all by mail. California is almost there. And Texas in the 2020 cycle had about 10% of its ballots from mail. Now, the challenge with this is you also then have an increasing use of lawfare, people oftentimes suing friendly jurisdictions. In other words, left-wing lawyers suing left-wing Democrat-controlled county areas to get them to do things that are contrary to state law and say, oh, you need to do this because of COVID or because you're disenfranchising certain voters. So you need to not follow the rules. And so what's happened over the years is you're getting this mishmash of results. The other thing that's fascinating is some states, they don't let you start processing the mail-in ballots and begin counting until the polls close. And in other states, you can start counting as soon as the polls open. And so then you have to really pay attention. Okay, which state, how does Pennsylvania do it? And so, for example, tonight, for quite a while, Fetterman was over Oz by something like almost 90-10. Well, that's because in Pennsylvania, the very first votes that were being counted were the mail-in ballots that were allowed to be counted at the beginning or the opening of election when the polls opened. So by the time the polls closed, they had a lot of those already counted. And so you had this huge dump of votes that were all for Fetterman.
Do you think do you think it confuses the average onlooker? I mean, even the midterms, which, most people just watch during the presidentials. But again, you've got this, Pennsylvania is like one of the number one states people are going to be watching. All of a sudden the returns come in and it's 90-10. And then in a few hours, all of a sudden it's like, 51-49.
Right.
Voter, people watching at home are like, how does that happen?
Right. Because it didn't used to happen. Right. I mean, you used to be able to kind of tell, oh, this urban area that's very Democratic hasn't voted yet, right? And then they'd vote and everything would change. Now you not only have to know which areas have voted, but you also have to know about what part of the mail-in ballots have been voted and which party did they favor. So, for example, in California, for years, the Republicans always did better than Democrats with what they call out there absentee ballots. But eventually, the Democrats figured out how to get an advantage on that. And starting about 2016, 2018, you started to see the Democrats do far better than Republicans in California on that issue. Now, just as an interesting aside, the Texas Public Policy Foundation hosted about 24 press liaisons from the French Foreign Ministry last week. Josh Trevino and I were talking to them. They were from Mexico, America, Canada, and the UN, all working for the French Foreign Ministry. And I asked one of them, I said, well, we have our election coming up, and we were talking a bit about that. And I already kind of knew the answer. I said, isn't it true? You know, in France in the 1970s, you got rid of mail-in balloting because it was too subject to fraud, too subject to being messed with. How do you do it now? And this guy laughs. He says, well, for the presidency, we all vote in person on one day.
And they're still able to count all the ballots by the end of the evening.
Immediately, right? Because they vote in person on one day.
So, so two questions really, back to back. Number one, what do you think the push for, early voting and mail-in ballots? I mean, is that just about convenience and all of that? And two, what is it about that process, or what is it about the way that we do things now that holds up the vote? I mean, you figure however you vote, whether it's in person or on that day or mail-in ballot, you still have to count all of those ballots. Why does it take so much longer now as a result?
I think that part of what's happening right now is we have these safeguards that we want to have built into the system. So you're using this electronic device that tabulates, and then you have a paper backup. That's what's really ideal. So in the case of Houston, they had a really long ballot. They had all these issues that made for like a 2-page paper ballot. And in some cases, you saw this, I think in Houston and around the country, they ran out of the paper and they had to go back and get some more. And of course, then people start to back up. And so there's also processes that have to be followed to really ensure that the vote is resilient from any sort of fraud, any sort of manipulation. And the problem when those processes aren't followed, as they weren't in Harris County, Houston, in 2020, as we found out, where they lost the chain of custody to 14 mobile ballot boxes, totaling close to 150,000 ballots. Now, does that mean that those ballots were improperly cast? Does that mean that there was fraud with all those 150,000? Well, probably not. It was probably just a screw up. But the problem is that makes people then lose some of the faith in their electoral process.
We don't know. And that's the biggest, that's
exactly. In addition, you have these lawsuits as well that also are done for partisan advantage. And those often slow down the process as well. So then as you look around the country, Brian, what I find interesting is we may not know the total balance in the U.S. Senate or the House of Representatives for another week. It may just be like it was in 2020, where you had all these results coming in and all these lawsuits. I think we can be pretty much assured that the House of Representatives has flipped to the Republican Party. I think probably the Senate will be a minimum of 51 Republican, 49 Democrat, could be as high as 53. And on the governor's side of things, probably a pickup or two. But again, we won't know for a while.
In the Texas state legislature, obviously we're, sessions coming up and all that. Election integrity, election reform was the number one issue, right? And I feel like conservatives were very happy with what they ended up with in the legislature. And yet here we are with Harris County still having problems. Here we are with, other counties still not being able to report until, late in the evening. Are there other reforms that we can get to get back to a situation where people can go to bed knowing what the results are?
I think it's instructive to look at what happened in Florida after 2000. So after the infamous 2000 election between George W. Bush and Vice President Gore, and you had the hanging chads and all of that, Florida was really embarrassed. And they went through and they really put a lot of effort into upgrading their election systems. And I think that they're one of the models now in the country. You're seeing very rapid and accurate results out of Florida, nothing like it was in the past. Now, there's a big difference between Texas and Florida. I mean, aside from the fact that we're the better state, right? Is that part of it is that the governor of Florida has more power than the governor of Texas. The governor of Florida can go, and if there's an official that's not doing their job, he can yank them, right? If they're not doing their job. So there's a little more central control and a little more ability for the governor there to kind of reform and clean things up. I'm not sure we could do that easily here without a constitutional amendment, nor am I sure that the legislature would want to give the governor more power here in Texas.
And of course, a constitutional amendment not only has to go through the legislature, but then has to go to the people in another election.
Right,
so you're even
exactly
pushing it even further beyond. And so since we don't have a lot of election returns, I really wanted this segment to be about, Chuck, tell us who won. Tell us. So we're not there. So I think this was an important discussion to talk about why it is that it's 9:30 at night and we still don't know, a lot of the races that won. So if we can't talk about election results, let's talk about election predictions,
Yeah, sure.
which is the polling in this country. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of it. I guess the first question is, look, it's polling.
Right.
The media craves it like cats to catnip, right? Like it's very important for them. Obviously the politicians, to any kind of public polling or any kind of, that it might influence, how they're doing in a particular race. So I understand why, to at least those folks, why it might be important, but to your mind, is it still a problem that some of the polls are so far off?
I think it is. And I think that pollsters are really going to have to start examining how they do this. Pardon me. What's the process? I know, most of us now use cell phones. When I see a number that I don't recognize, I don't answer the phone. And if there's a message, I might call them back. Right. So that you think, wow, if that's the case around the country, how many people are they really getting? Right. You think of the classic person using a landline. What are they, like an average of 77 years old or something? So
I've had a landline since college, so I don't have any idea.
Yeah, I mean, I've got one. It's a VoIP. I never answer it, but I've got it as a backup emergency if something were to happen. So you look to our north in Oklahoma, Governor Stitt, it looks to be being comfortably reelected. The last I looked a few minutes ago, I think he was up 16, 17, 18 points, right? There was a poll about 10 days ago in Oklahoma that had his Democratic challenger up 1 point. Okay. That's about a 18 to 19 point swing between that poll, which was done by, I think a university and some major news outlet. I mean, it wasn't some fly-by-night operation, but, and I'm hearing from my contacts, because as the foundation does some work up in Oklahoma. Oh, the legislature thinks that Stitt's in trouble and his enemies are thinking he's not going to make it. The dude is like close to 20 points, right? It's like, wait a minute. So even the politicians that operate in that environment thought that he might have been in trouble.
Do you think that that's just as, is there any conspiracy behind why polls like that come out and they're so wrong? Because obviously no one, I mean, there's no penalty to pay for being so wrong on the polling, right?
I think that some of the polls were probably done in a way that were shaping the electorate. So for example, if you look at the generic polling for Congress, right? Obviously you don't vote for a generic congressman, but we like to look at generic polling because it kind of gives a hint about which party might do better in the general election. And so what I noticed was, if you looked at the polling of likely voters versus registered voters, and as you know, because you've commissioned countless polls, probably several times more than I have, and I've probably done, at least a dozen in my political career, maybe more, some here at the foundation. As you know, a likely voter poll is more expensive than a registered voter poll, right? You have to go through a few more steps and ask a few more questions and ask a lot more people, right? So what was interesting to me is that there was a fairly decent divergence between registered voter and likely voter, where the registered voter polls favored the Democrats by an extra 3 points or so. As time got closer to the election, that divergence grew to like 6 or 7 points, where the registered voter polls were favoring Democrats by 6 or 7 points more than the likely voter polls. And so you're looking at this and you're just like, why would you even do a registered voter poll this close to the election anyway? I'm not interested in registered voters. As a former elected official, I'm only interested in voters who vote.
And again, for some folks who are listening now, there's a huge difference between a registered voter, because you only have, especially in the midterms, you only have about 50 or 60% participation. So you're talking about including 40% of your sample of people who aren't even going to go to the polls, but they might be registered. So that's why you get thrown off.
And so when you look at this, you wonder, well, are they doing registered voter polls because it's cheap, or are they trying to shape the electorate by suggesting that the Democrats in this case are going to do better, and getting people to be more enthusiastic or more discouraged depending on how they view it? So that's one example. With the rest, like with the Stitt poll that showed his opponent, his Democratic opponent, up by 1, and then how he's crushing, he's winning on election night, I think it just may go back to the fact that people don't answer their phones like they used to 30 years ago. And the pollsters have not yet adjusted and figured out how to get a proper random sample from people like me that aren't going to talk to some stranger. I don't want to waste my time with some stranger.
We don't even need to get into online polls. Like that's a whole other, yeah.
Right. And that's self-selecting. So
Yeah.
how do you deal with
That's
that?
right.
Right. So I think there's going to have to be some new polling methodology that's going to have to come out of all of this that will restore some degree of accuracy and trust in polling.
So two very interesting topics. Want to make sure we hit that since we don't have a whole lot of results to. But I mean, the breaking news over the last 48 hours is that Trump's going to run again. And so I've got to get as a long time. I mean, you've been in the process, you've run for races, you've won, you've served. You've been watching this a long time. I mean, you come from California, the home of Reagan. I mean, you probably consider yourself to be a strong Reagan conservative from if those principles still exist back in the day. Yeah. So I'm just curious what you think of today's, of the party today and kind of that direction that it's going. And then the idea of Trump getting back into the race, potentially, running against like a DeSantis or maybe even a Ted Cruz and Greg Abbott and those folks.
I think what's really fascinating about the last 20 or so years in the trajectory of the parties is that if you go back to the 90s, the left was saying, we've got this, right? We're going to be in power forever because every presidential cycle, the number of people in this country who vote who are not white, right, non-Hispanic whites, grows by about 2%. And so just through the tyranny of math, you're going to see more and more people of color, and we're going to start winning these elections because of that. It's inevitable, right? That was the theory. And then a funny thing happened on your way to inevitable victory forever, right? You saw the Democratic Party begin to be taken over by white elites, mostly on the coasts, people who had deep educational backgrounds, either as academics or as highly paid professionals. And you began to see the Republican Party start to pick up working, in many cases, people without college degrees, which, by the way, are the majority of adults in this country. Still, even with the free college that Biden wants to give people.
Checks haven't cleared yet, but
yeah, exactly. And so the parties began this long, slow realignment. You briefly saw a glimmer of that during Reagan's era. They were called Reagan Democrats back then. And you certainly saw it when Trump first ran. It was like an inflection point. You saw this pretty significant divergence in what were considered to be kind of the traditional bastions of each party. And I think that process is continuing to sort itself out. And you're seeing, for example, in Texas, the evidence of that, of course, is most prominently found in the Rio Grande Valley. And I think it's very fascinating. If I were to like say, well, gee, if I was like some party chieftain, who would I, which side would I rather be? Well, definitely I'd rather be a Republican right now, because when you think about the elites that the Democrats are now finding themselves having their policies being driven by, they are a tiny sliver of the American population, not a lot of people. And what you find is there's not a lot of support for example, doing radical surgery on children, right? Doing double mastectomies and hysterectomies and castrations on children, and basically making it so that they're sterile for the rest of their life. Really? You're going to do that to someone who is not even able to consent? Really? But that's where they are.
It's gruesome that that's now a party platform for them. But getting back to, the real news of the day is, how do you think Trump's entrance into the race is going to affect the next 2 years?
So is it official? I mean, I heard he was teasing it at the speech. He said there's going to be a big announcement in a week or two.
Let's assume for the sake that he wouldn't just tease it like that. But let's say if he gets into it, what are the dynamics do you see going forward for the next 2 years?
Well, I certainly think that things are going to be vigorously contested. I believe, the President Trump.
No one's stepping aside and saying, well, it's your nomination, Mr. President.
Certainly not everybody's going to step aside, because, of course, people have certain timelines on their own political careers, like it may be now or never. In certain cases, as a governor, you may have a free ride. You can run and you don't have to give up your seat because you're still governor, right? That's attractive. President Trump now has a record that people can run. He can run on his record. People can criticize his record. I think that I think it's healthy for the party. And I certainly would, again, rather be in our position than being led by this guy who's almost an octogenarian that like wanders around on the stage and wonders where the heck he is.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, we've talked a little bit about behind the scenes tonight. I mean, the fight to figure out if they're going to even nominate Joe Biden.
No, they're not going to nominate
to begin. Actually, will probably more interesting than even like, Trump versus DeSantis and so on. Well, this has been great. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of results to talk to you about tonight, but we did get some really good info about why that is. I mean, why is it that it's taking so long now for us to get to the results? This is the last segment for tonight. So if you followed along with us on Facebook Live, we really appreciate it. Again, I'm Brian Phillips with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Chuck, thanks so much for being here and bringing up the rear. Last but not least, of course, on these segments. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're going to keep following things, and we're going to have more analysis, I'm sure, with our various products, with our email products, and with our various research and op-eds and things. Find all of that information at texaspolicy.com. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.
Good night.